Hollywood sold itself as a dream factory. Bright lights, big smiles, safe illusions. But behind the studio gates and velvet ropes was another power structure entirely. One that didn't answer to agents or executives, only to leverage, fear, and the kind of silence that can't be bought with money. These weren't mob bosses. These were actors and actresses, famous faces who got too close, pushed back, tried to leave, or simply became useful to the wrong people. And in that shadow economy, usefulness is never free. Number 13. Peter Lorre. He made a career out of playing men hunted by dread. By the late 1940s, it wasn't acting anymore. After his breakthrough and a successful transition into Hollywood, he found himself trapped in a system that offered prestige but very little control. Medical issues, unstable income, and a dependency that the industry gossiped about made him vulnerable. Exactly the kind of vulnerability that attracts help you can't safely refuse. In Hollywood, loans didn't always come from banks. They came from well-dressed intermediaries, quiet men in expensive suits who operated around nightclubs, booking offices and private gambling rooms. Miss a payment, and the consequences didn't look like a lawsuit. They looked like whispers, insurance concerns, suddenly unreliable reputations, and casting doors that close without explanation. Lorre tried to pull away. He left town repeatedly, chasing work in Europe and on stage, chasing distance like it was oxygen. But distance doesn't erase debts when the debt isn't just money, it's leverage. Friends later described him as paranoid, withdrawn, convinced he was being watched. In an era where surveillance and intimidation were a business model, that fear didn't come out of nowhere. His later years carried the cost. Fewer major roles, more instability, and a reputation that hardened into the industry's favorite career-ending word: difficult. He died in 1964 at 59, remembered as a genius character actor, and as a warning about what happens when desperation meets predators. Number 12. Jean Harlow. She was marketed as a fantasy. Platinum hair, electric smile, the illusion of a woman untouchable by consequences. But the early 1930s Hollywood party circuit wasn't just champagne and cameras. It blurred into back rooms, gambling, fixers, men who could make problems disappear because they created them first. Harlow didn't have to join anything. She only had to be valuable enough to orbit the wrong circle. Then came the death of her husband, Paul Byrne, in 1932, officially ruled a suicide, immediately surrounded by questions. The speed with which the machine sealed the story fueled decades of suspicion. MGM was famous for controlling narratives, and in that era, studios didn't just fear scandal. They feared the people scandal attracted. Afterward, the men around Harlow were increasingly volatile. Possessive, threatening, watched by police, known by studio security. Protection was never only about safety. It was about liability, about keeping her profitable and quiet. Her health collapsed fast. Symptoms were minimized. Work schedules continued. Whether it was negligence, pressure, or simply a system that treated humans like inventory, the result was the same. She deteriorated in public while the people in charge pretended it was nothing. She died in 1937 at 26. The farewell was controlled. The questions were not. And her story became a template Hollywood repeated for decades. When a star becomes too tangled in power, the industry doesn't investigate. It repackages the tragedy and moves on. Number 11. Judy Garland. She didn't go looking for underworld pressure. Underworld pressure went looking for her. By the late 1940s, Garland's fame was massive, and her control over her own life was not. Years of studio conditioning left her physically fragile, emotionally exhausted, and financially vulnerable in a way the public rarely understood. That vulnerability mattered because live entertainment routes, big cities, big venues, big money, were often dominated by promoters and booking power players with muscle behind them. Not always obvious muscle. Sometimes it was just the unspoken fact that certain people ran the rooms. When she performed, the rooms filled. The money poured in. And yet, the profits didn't seem to stick to her. Expenses inflated. Contracts became traps. Cancellations came with threats, legal pressure, reputation pressure, the kind of pressure that makes a sick person climb on stage anyway. People close to Garland described her as terrified of confrontation, convinced she was being controlled. Her schedule, her access to doctors, her ability to breathe without owing someone. Even if every fear can't be proven detail by detail, the pattern is painfully consistent with how predatory entertainment structures worked in that era. She died in 1969 at 47, famous, exhausted, and broke enough that the contrast felt obscene. In the Dream Factory, She wasn't treated like a person. She was treated like an asset that kept earning until it couldn't. Number 10. George Raft. George Raft didn't just play gangsters. He understood the rules they lived by, and that understanding shaped his entire career. Before Hollywood ever noticed him, Raft came up through nightclub culture, where organized crime wasn't a rumor or a shadow. It was infrastructure. Clubs were territories. Bookings were permissions. Violence didn't have to be visible to be effective. It only had to be implied. Raft learned early who controlled the rooms, who paid the bands, and who decided which careers advanced and which quietly stalled. When he arrived in Hollywood, Raft didn't sever those ties. He leaned into them. He socialized openly with underworld figures, appeared at their tables, and treated the association as proof of authenticity. It gave him credibility, especially when he began playing tough, streetwise characters on screen. His performances felt lived in because, in many ways, they were. At first, the studios tolerated it, even benefited from it. Raft's connections helped smooth negotiations, calm disputes, and add a layer of protection around productions operating in cities where influence was rarely clean. But tolerance has an expiration date, especially when federal attention enters the picture. By the post-war years, Hollywood's relationship with organized crime had become dangerous rather than convenient. Investigations increased. Insurance companies grew cautious. Studios realized that being too close to the wrong people could poison an entire production. What once looked like toughness now looked like risk. Raft refused to adjust. He would not cooperate with authorities. He would not name names. Loyalty mattered to him, even when it no longer served him. That loyalty may have earned him safety in one world, but it cost him dearly in another. Roles began to disappear. Not all at once, but subtly. Leading parts went to actors who carried less baggage. Scripts that might have been his were redirected. The industry never said, "We're done with you." Hollywood rarely does. It simply stops calling. Raft lived long enough to feel that betrayal stretch out over decades. Hollywood loves authenticity until authenticity brings heat. And when the heat rises, it abandons people quickly and quietly. Now, the men Raft once drank with didn't rescue him when the work dried up. The studios didn't feel obligated to look back. By the time his finances collapsed, the illusion of protection was gone. He died in 1980 nearly broke, remembered as a man who lived too close to the fire and mistook proximity to power for armor. Raft's legacy reads like a warning, written between the lines of Hollywood history. Connections can elevate you, but they don't belong to you. And when the system decides you're no longer worth defending, what once felt like strength becomes a target you can't escape. Number 9. Lana Turner. Lana Turner survived the collision with organized crime. That doesn't mean she escaped the consequences. By the 1950s, Turner was one of Hollywood's most carefully managed assets, glamorous, profitable, and relentlessly controlled. That control shattered when her private life became entangled with Johnny Stompanado, a violent enforcer connected to the Los Angeles underworld. Inside the industry, his reputation wasn't a mystery. He was known to be volatile, controlling, and dangerous. The kind of man whose threats didn't need to be explicit, because everyone understood what stood behind them. Studio executives were aware long before the public ever learned his name. Security reports documented incidents. Friends noticed bruises. Fear wasn't speculation. It was lived reality. But Hollywood's response wasn't protection. It was containment. That distinction matters. Containment keeps the box office intact. It minimizes exposure. It delays reckoning. As long as the violence stayed private, the system treated it as manageable. Turner wasn't encouraged to escape. She was encouraged to endure quietly. Everything changed on April 4th, 1958. When Stompanado confronted Turner in her Beverly Hills home and was stabbed by her teenage daughter during the chaos, the illusion collapsed instantly. The story exploded beyond Hollywood's ability to manage it. And visibility is the one thing organized power despises. Turner didn't need retaliation to be punished. She received something Hollywood specialized in: humiliation as spectacle. Her private terror became public theater. Trials followed. Headlines dissected her life. Bruises once hidden were transformed into testimony, consumed by millions. Legally, the outcome favored her family. The killing was ruled justifiable. But Hollywood justice doesn't end with verdicts. Reputations don't heal on court rulings. They heal only when powerful people decide they're safe again. Turner returned to the screen and delivered strong performances. But the posture around her had shifted. Insurance premiums rose. Scripts changed. Control tightened. She was no longer treated as untouchable. She was treated as a risk, And behind the scenes, the fear never fully left. When you've lived close to men who treat power like a weapon, safety doesn't feel permanent. Even survival feels provisional. Lana Turner lived decades beyond the Stompanado case, but she never escaped its shadow. Her story became proof of something Hollywood rarely admits. Surviving organized crime influence doesn't restore your power. It only proves how easily it can be taken, and how long the cost lingers after the blood is gone. Number 8. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe existed at a crossroads most people never see, and few survive. The point where fame, politics, and men who treated silence as a survival skill all overlapped. By the early 1960s, Monroe was no longer just a movie star. She was access. Access to rooms most people were never invited into. Access to conversations that weren't meant to be recorded. Access to power that didn't wear a uniform or leave paperwork behind. Her beauty and fame made her desirable, but her vulnerability made her usable. And in Hollywood's shadow economy, usefulness is dangerous. The world around Monroe operated on favors, not contracts. Organized crime didn't always arrive with threats or violence. Often it arrived wearing a tuxedo, hosting the party, financing the venue, or quietly controlling the pipeline that connected Hollywood to Las Vegas entertainment circuits. These weren't mobsters in the caricature sense. They were intermediaries, men who knew everyone, paid for everything, and remembered what was owed. Monroe moved through these spaces whether she wanted to or not. She was introduced, invited, expected. Her associations with mob-linked social circles have been debated for decades, usually tangled with Cold War paranoia and political scandal. But the lack of clean proof is part of the story. This was a world designed to remain unprovable. No receipts, no signatures, only implications. Friends described Monroe as increasingly anxious. She worried about phone taps, about being watched, about conversations being repeated to people she never meant to involve. She spoke about feeling used and then abruptly discarded. Valuable one moment, inconvenient the next. Even if every theory is stripped down to its most conservative version, what remains is still bleak. She was isolated inside overlapping power structures that all benefited from her silence. Her fame, paradoxically, made escape harder. Studios grew impatient with her fragility. Political allies kept their distance. The men who once wanted proximity disappeared when proximity became risky. By 1962, Monroe was profoundly alone. When she died at 36, the official explanation arrived fast and stayed shallow. Contradictions piled up, timelines blurred, witness accounts conflicted, records vanished or never existed. Not because of one grand conspiracy, but because too many interests shared the same desire. Closure without exposure. Yes, Marilyn Monroe didn't have to challenge the Mafia publicly to pay a price. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't testify. She didn't expose secrets. In Hollywood's shadow economy, sometimes knowing the wrong people, being desired by the wrong people, is enough to make your life feel unlivable. Her tragedy wasn't just death. It was realizing too late that fame doesn't protect you when power prefers silence. It only makes you harder to ignore and easier to erase. Number 7. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's relationship with organized crime wasn't rumor. It wasn't scandal-driven mythology. It was an open secret, and the kind that follows you for life. Sinatra rose in an entertainment world where mob influence wasn't hidden at the edges. It sat at the center. Nightclubs, booking agencies, labor unions, and performance circuits were frequently controlled, directly or indirectly, by organized crime. If you wanted access, protection, or momentum, you didn't always go through official channels. You went through people who could make things happen quietly. Early in his career, that proximity looked like opportunity. Better rooms, reliable bookings, protection from problems that ruined less connected performers. Sinatra benefited from that system, and he never pretended otherwise. The issue wasn't that he knew these men. It was that he stayed loyal to them long after he no longer needed to. Benefits, in that world, come with expectations. Sinatra maintained friendships with powerful mob figures, even as his public image shifted toward patriotic icon and cultural institution. The federal authorities tracked him for decades, not always because they could prove crimes, but because proximity itself mattered. In mid-century America, who you stood next to could be as dangerous as what you did. Image was everything. And Sinatra's image kept brushing against men, politicians publicly condemned while privately navigating around. The fracture came when politics entered the equation. Sinatra believed he could act as a bridge, connecting Hollywood glamour, organized influence, and national power. During the Kennedy era, he expected loyalty to flow both ways. Instead, Robert Kennedy launched one of the most aggressive crackdowns on organized crime in U.S. history. Overnight, Sinatra's associations transformed from assets into liabilities. Phone calls stopped getting returned. Invitations disappeared. Relationships he thought were solid fractured under pressure. Sinatra didn't die because of it. That wasn't the price he paid. His price was suspicion, permanent, lingering, and humiliating. Doors closed quietly, not slammed, quietly. The most effective kind. He spent the rest of his life proving something uncomfortable. You can be adored by millions and still be trapped by the company you keep. Neither side ever fully claimed him. The mob couldn't protect him from political reality. Politics wouldn't protect him from his past. Sinatra lived long, wealthy, and celebrated. But the shadow never left. He learned, slowly and painfully, that standing between Hollywood and organized crime is never stable ground. Eventually, one side always demands distance, and when that moment comes, loyalty becomes a liability. Frank Sinatra didn't lose everything, but he lost the illusion that power, once borrowed, can ever truly be returned. Number 6. Dean Martin. Dean Martin perfected an image that looked effortless. A half smile, a drink in hand, a voice that never sounded strained. He made everything feel loose, casual, safe. What that image concealed was how sharp the world around him actually was. Martin's rise and longevity were inseparable from the nightclub and casino circuits that defined mid-century entertainment. These weren't neutral stages. They were territories. Las Vegas, high-end clubs, private rooms. Many were controlled directly or indirectly by organized crime interests. Who performed where, how often, and under what conditions was rarely just a booking decision. It was permission. Martin benefited from that proximity. Being welcomed into those rooms gave him access other performers never touched. Premium venues, reliable paydays, insulation from certain problems. Protection didn't always look like bodyguards. Sometimes it looked like silence. Problems that didn't escalate. Conflicts that vanished before becoming public. In that world, that kind of smoothness wasn't accidental. But proximity is never free. Even when no contract is signed, a deal exists. Access implies obligation. And obligation, in a power system built on favors, doesn't come with clear terms. You don't embarrass the wrong people. You don't ask questions you don't want answered. You don't pretend not to understand who actually owns the building. The cost of Martin's relationships rarely surfaced as scandal. That's what makes them easy to dismiss in hindsight. Instead, the price arrived quietly. Surveillance, whispers, scrutiny from authorities who understood that entertainment and organized influence overlapped more often than the industry admitted. Your name becomes part of a larger narrative you don't control, and once it does, you never fully escape it. By the later decades of his career, the myth hardened. Dean Martin as the eternally unbothered king of cool, the man who floated above consequences. That myth served Hollywood well. It suggested charm was immunity. The truth was more fragile. Many entertainers survived that era by becoming fluent in the language of powerful men. Smile, perform. Don't pry. Don't disrupt the ecosystem that feeds you. Coolness wasn't just style, it was camouflage. Martin paid the price, the way many did. Not through destruction, but through conditional comfort. His freedom existed only as long as he stayed within invisible boundaries. The wrong kind of honesty, the wrong kind of defiance, could have collapsed everything he'd built. He made it look easy. That was the skill. And that skill, in mid-century Hollywood, was often the difference between longevity and disappearance. Number 5. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. could light up any room, and the room still reminded him, constantly, who owned it. Like Dean Martin, Davis worked the most powerful circuits in entertainment. Las Vegas showrooms, elite clubs, private events where money moved fast, and influence sat closer than the spotlight. These weren't just stages. They were controlled environments. And control meant rules that were never written down. Davis understood those rules early. He had to. In those rooms, you could be the star on stage and still be treated like an accessory off it. Applause didn't equal authority. Talent didn't equal power. Power belonged to the people who could cancel your booking, pull your protection, or quietly make your life harder without ever raising their voice. His friendships and professional ties placed him close to powerful gatekeepers. Sometimes, that proximity offered protection. Other times, it created pressure. In spaces where organized influence existed, popularity wasn't just fame. It was leverage. A famous face draws crowds. Crowds print money. Money attracts people who want control. Davis navigated that reality with intelligence and adaptability. He learned when to perform, when to soften, when to stay silent. That adaptability kept him working. It also cost him something harder to measure. Now, his price wasn't a dramatic downfall or a single explosive moment. It was cumulative. The grinding reality of living inside rooms where power had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with hierarchy. Where you were welcomed, but never fully equal. Where compromise wasn't a choice you made once, but a posture you maintained for decades. Davis became a symbol of brilliance thriving under constraint. Publicly, he was celebrated. Privately, he carried the weight of navigating systems that demanded deference, even as they profited from his talent. Compromise kept doors open. It also narrowed who you were, allowed to be behind them. Hollywood rarely frames this as a cost. It prefers success stories. But survival inside a machine built on control always extracts a private toll. The audience sees the applause. They don't see the calculations, the restraint, the moments when saying the wrong thing could have ended everything. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't lose to organized power. He endured it. And endurance, stretched across a lifetime, leaves marks that no standing ovation can erase. Number 4. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner wasn't fragile, and in mid-century Hollywood, that alone made her a problem. She didn't cultivate delicacy. She didn't perform gratitude. She drank hard, spoke plainly, laughed loudly, and refused to apologize for occupying space. That independence made her magnetic to audiences, and deeply unsettling to men who believed power only worked if it was obeyed quietly. Gardner moved through elite social circles that overlapped heavily with the nightlife economy. Private clubs, casino-connected venues, international parties, and backroom gatherings where influence was traded long before it was documented. These spaces weren't always overtly criminal. They didn't need to be. They were environments where favors mattered more than contracts, and where reputation functioned as leverage. Say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and consequences didn't arrive in writing. Her relationships placed her close to volatile ecosystems, powerful men, jealous men, men who confused access with ownership. Some were studio figures. Some were political or financial operators. Others moved in and out of underworld-adjacent circles without ever advertising it. Gardner didn't seek protection from these worlds, and she didn't offer obedience either. That refusal created friction everywhere she went. In Hollywood, politeness was armor. Gardner refused to wear it. The punishment for that kind of refusal was rarely direct. It didn't look like threats or blackmail. It looked like narratives being rewritten without her consent. Press coverage subtly shifting tone. Studio patience thinning. Rumors spreading that framed her independence as instability. When she pushed back, she was labeled difficult, a word that carried more career-ending power than any courtroom ruling. Reputation in that era wasn't just gossip, it was currency. And Gardner's refusal to play the expected role made her expensive to manage. When stars were controllable, studios protected them. When they weren't, protection quietly evaporated. Gardner survived physically. She lived long enough to watch her myth solidify into something simpler than the woman herself. The reckless beauty, the tempest, the troublemaker. Yeah, that version erased context. It erased the constant pressure of navigating rooms owned by unseen interests. It erased how often strength is punished more harshly than weakness. Her price wasn't a single scandal or a public downfall. It was the accumulation of conflict, a life spent negotiating power she didn't ask for, inside systems that demanded compliance as the cost of safety. Fame didn't shield her. It made her visible, and visibility is never neutral when power prefers silence. Ava Gardner survived Hollywood, but survival isn't peace. Sometimes the real cost is realizing, years later, how many doors you walked through were never truly open, only permitted. Number 3. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart's image was built on defiance. The man who couldn't be pushed, couldn't be owned, couldn't be bent. That image wasn't invented. Yeah, it was earned. And it came with consequences the legend rarely acknowledges. The studio era wasn't just about films and fame. It was an ecosystem powered by labor agreements, unions, booking venues, and nightlife circuits that extended far beyond sound stages. In that world, organized influence didn't always announce itself. It existed in the margins, rarely credited, frequently feared, and always understood by people who needed to survive it. Bogart clashed openly with authority. Studio executives, political pressure groups, and anyone who attempted to script his beliefs found him uncooperative. He spoke out when silence was expected. He refused to retreat when others advised caution. That independence was admirable, but it was also disruptive in a town that ran on predictability and control. The price Bogart paid wasn't dramatic. There was no single scandal, No explosive confrontation, no moment Hollywood could package neatly. His cost was structural. When you resist a system built on leverage, the response isn't always punishment, it's management. Roles shift, opportunities narrow, invitations quietly stop coming. You're still working, still visible, but the margins tighten. Projects you might have anchored move to safer names. You become respected, but less indulged. In an era where money and muscle often intersected behind the scenes, being difficult to control was a risk calculation studios didn't enjoy making. Bogart wasn't dangerous in the criminal sense, but he was dangerous to the illusion that everyone could be handled. He remained a star because his talent was undeniable, but even legends feel the weight of resistance. The system doesn't need to destroy you to discipline you. It just needs to remind you, consistently, that defiance has limits. Bogart's legacy is often framed as effortless toughness. The truth is quieter and sharper. In mid-century Hollywood, defiance required endurance. Not every price is paid in headlines. Some are paid in stalled momentum, narrowed paths, and the slow understanding that independence is tolerated only as long as it doesn't disrupt power. Bogart stayed standing, but he stood inside a system that never stopped watching him, measuring how far his defiance would go and how much it would cost to allow it. Number 2. Rita Hayworth. She was sold as a fantasy so completely that the world forgot she was a human being first. Rita Hayworth wasn't just marketed, she was manufactured. Studios reshaped her hairline, her name, her voice, and her image until she became an idealized object of desire. That transformation made her famous. It also made her vulnerable. By the height of her stardom in the 1940s, Hayworth moved through elite social spaces where power didn't come from contracts alone. High-end nightclubs, private parties, international trips, and political adjacent circles blurred together. In those spaces, wealth and influence often traveled quietly, through favors, introductions, and unspoken obligations. Some of the men who circulated in these environments were legitimate power brokers. Others were not. The distinction was rarely obvious, and it rarely mattered. The danger for Hayworth was never about formally joining the underworld. It was about being claimed by a system that treated women like currency. Her beauty, her fame, and her availability were all perceived as assets. Powerful men, some clean, some not, believed proximity to her enhanced their status. Access itself became a form of ownership. Hayworth's marriages reflected that imbalance. She was repeatedly drawn into relationships where control outweighed care. Her private life became public property, dissected by press and studio alike, while her autonomy quietly eroded. When she resisted, the backlash wasn't violent. It was psychological. Isolation, misrepresentation, the constant rewriting of her narrative by people with louder voices and better connections. In Hollywood's shadow economy, glamour functioned as camouflage. It looked like protection, but it was only packaging. Packaging doesn't stop predators. It attracts them. The more iconic Hayworth became, the less room she had to exist outside the image imposed on her. Every public appearance reinforced the fantasy. Every private struggle was dismissed as instability rather than a rational response to sustained exploitation. Her later years were marked by confusion, emotional distress, and declining health, long before her Alzheimer's diagnosis was understood or acknowledged. While not every hardship can be directly traced to organized crime influence, the broader environment is impossible to ignore. She lived in an era where powerful men treated Hollywood like a marketplace, and actresses like her were the most valuable merchandise. Rita Hayworth didn't mess with the Mafia, in a cinematic sense. She didn't challenge it, expose it, or profit from it knowingly. Her mistake, if it can be called that, was being too valuable in a system where value invites possession. The price she paid wasn't a headline scandal or a single violent moment. It was the slow loss of control over her own life, in a world that confused desire with entitlement. Number 1. Johnny Stompanado. This story sits at number 1 for a reason. It's the clearest illustration of what happens when underworld proximity stops being discreet and spills blood in public. Johnny Stompanado wasn't an actor. He wasn't a producer. He wasn't part of Hollywood's illusion. He was an enforcer, violent, volatile, and deeply embedded in Los Angeles organized crime circles tied to Mickey Cohen. His power didn't come from charm or reputation. It came from who stood behind him and what they were known to do. When Stompanado became involved with Lana Turner, the collision between Hollywood and the underworld became impossible to ignore. Inside the industry, his presence set off alarms long before the public ever learned his name. Studio security documented incidents. Friends noticed bruises. Threats weren't subtle. They were explicit. The relationship was fueled by control and fear. Stompanado leveraged his mob associations constantly, reminding Turner, directly and indirectly, that leaving him wouldn't be simple. This wasn't romantic obsession. It was intimidation, backed by implication. People around Turner hesitated to intervene, not because they didn't care, but because they understood what escalation could mean. This is where Hollywood's machinery failed catastrophically. The industry didn't protect her. It contained her. As long as the situation stayed private, it was treated as manageable. Visibility, not safety, was the true concern. That illusion shattered on April 4th, 1958, when Stompanado confronted Turner at her Beverly Hills home. During the chaos, Turner's teenage daughter, Cheryl Crane, stabbed him. He died at the scene. The underworld didn't retaliate publicly, but it didn't have to. The trial was swift. The verdict was justifiable homicide. Legally, the case closed. Culturally, the damage was irreversible. Hollywood went into full crisis mode. Narratives were shaped. Details softened. The industry's priority was not truth. It was distance. Distance from organized crime. Distance from questions. Distance from the possibility that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom. Nay, the lesson Hollywood learned was brutal and pragmatic. Violence wasn't the biggest threat. Exposure was. Stompanado hadn't crossed the Mafia. He embarrassed it. He brought its methods into the spotlight. Hollywood loves to sell danger on screen. But when it flirted with real power, real leverage, real intimidation, it discovered something it couldn't edit in post. The Mafia didn't care about fame. Studios didn't care about loyalty. And for the actors and actresses caught between them, the price was rarely a single dramatic moment. It was the slow realization that in the Dream Factory, the scariest roles were the ones you never auditioned for.